Hey guys, this is Miko here. I'm back with another tier list. This is going to be for the PTR patch that is going to be coming out in approximately 2 weeks. Going to be a little bit less than that by the time this video goes out. But let's hop right into it. So starting off, with Killsquad, Firestop is going to be taking over the game. Firestop Ice Gauntlet seems to be the best variant of that, where you kind of go either a spike, a util, or a pylon variant, depending if you want ult charge, if you want to stay alive, or if you want to try to pressure people. I think Ice Spike significantly outclasses Blunderbuss because Blunderbuss does not have access to that old Fortify. It has new Fortify, which effectively does nothing in Light, and Firestaff you tend to want to play in Light. That being said, Firestaff Blunderbuss still has really good burst and is still a really good build, but I think Firestaff Ice Gauntlet just outclasses it with the latest nerf to Blunderbuss. Bow Rapier seems like a very solid build that was strong last patch, will be even better this patch due to the changes where people will be trying to pry out elemental aversion will not have shirking fort. I don't think people are going to pry out physical aversion as much, and that's where Bow Rapier can kind of take a stab in the meta and do some really cool things. That being said, Bow Rapier I think is a little bit outclassed by Firestop, but due to the everyone's going to be warding towards fire, I think it opens up the door for Bow Rapier to do things. Great Axe will be a really good build. It was a good build on the current patch. This is typically run in light. It is really good at closing distance, killing healers, and preventing people from escaping due to its very good. It has a very large amount of stam generation, which you could use to close distance as well as confirm kills. It seems like it will be very solid, even though it has the nerfs coming through, because people won't be able to have Shirking Fort anymore and sort of ward to it indirectly with that. And due to the nerfs that it's having across the board, but due to the buffs that compensate for the Shirking Fort being removed, I still see this build being very solid in a Killsquad. Medium Spear Rapier and Medium Greatsword Hatchet are kind of two in the same boat where they're going to be disruption oriented builds that are mostly used to zone and prevent people from casting freely. I think both these builds have a spot. I think the Spear is a little bit better because Spear has a little bit a better potential for disrupting people, but both of them seem solid. Both of them have been played in the past. Spear Rapier is a little bit more dated, but has been resurgent due to the Spear buffs that have happened and due to the various nerfs that hit all the other melee classes except for Spear. Light IGVG I don't think will be as defining as it once was, but seems to have an opportunity to come back in the spotlight due to Shirking Fort nerfs and due to Spike getting around Elemental Aversion. Void Gauntlet also has access to Old Ren, so you will basically be able to set yourself up for 6 to 8k Ice Spikes, which should be significant enough to warrant maybe going this build. You add in some combo pieces before, a little bit of support from a teammate, and you can definitely get out there and one-shot people with this build. S Hatchet seems like a good build to engage on enemies, like the Spear Rapier and Greatsword Hatchet, but has a little bit better survivability and does a little bit less damage. It's a little bit less scary, or it's a little bit less scary as a whole compared to other weapons. Seems solid, but I don't think it's going to be very good as a whole in the meta. Spear Hatchet and Bow Hatchet, I think, are both in similar boats where they're not bad, but have the struggle with both of them is their ability to chase. Spear Hatchet obviously has to close the distance. I don't think Spear Hatchet's going to be as good as closing the distance as Spear Rapier, and then you lose that opportunity to get the stagger on Flourish and finish. Well, not the finish anymore, but the Flourish at least. Firestaff Voidblade I think is a build that can kind of be a hybrid build that I don't think will be bad, but I think is outclassed by other kinds of Firestaffs. It's still a solid build, but I wouldn't run it on every aspect in the game. I think it's a good build for 3v3. I think it's a decent build for OPR, but when it gets a bigger scale, I think it falls off a bit. Bow's Spear is a build that has a lot of potential, but hasn't really been mastered yet. I don't think anyone has mastered Bow Spear on live, but people have been playing around with the Javelin that runs people into basically bows just one-shotting people. That combo on PTR gets nerfed significantly due to the Ren being new Ren, which effectively does nothing. Unless that gets changed, I'd expect this build to not really be that popular, but even with it not being around, I think it's a decent build at controlling space in your backline that can replace what IGBB used to do. Bow Greatsword seems like a hybrid build, sort of like Bow Spear, that has fallen off and could be good, but due to nerfs, I don't think it's going to be resurgent. IGBB has fallen off all the way down to being almost good. I don't think Blunderbuss does enough now. It has really bad survivability in light. It does decent damage, but as a whole, it's just outclassed by Firestaff, and it doesn't make sense to go this build as much anymore. Great Axe Blunderbuss was good at one point. Both weapons got nerfed significantly, and I don't think have a spot in the meta. BB Warhammer, same old, got nerfed so much that I don't think they're viable anymore. Void Blade Ice Gauntlet, I think, could be okay in a Killsquad, but I think it just gets harassed by ranged players that can basically just one-shot it, and it doesn't work in that kind of setup due to its lack of an ability to close distance. And even if it does close distance, if people just block a Void Blade, they'll never be able to do enough damage to actually get value with that roll. BB Hatchet, I think, is not used anymore. It was a fun build at the time, just not popular. SNS BB, I don't think can be used anymore in Musket. Last but not least, the current PTR patch is not usable whatsoever and will not be played unless it finds a niche spot in like holding space with range, which from what has happened in the PTR so far, it seems like the musket is not able to even shoot from maybe 50 meters out. It seems outranged by bow and fire staff and basically every other weapon with less survivability. It does not seem very good as a whole at the moment. Moving on to ball builds, Great Axe Warhammer I think is still not bad. The problem is Warhammer's Ren doesn't do anything anymore. It still sets up for other people to do stuff, but there's not much that can be done with that. On top of this, if you land a stun and someone just taps them with any ability, they will be woken up, so to speak, and it won't really do that much. As well as people tend to have passive freedom now, so as a whole, that build got nerfed. Great Axe also doesn't really do damage anymore. This is more of a setting people up to get clump build. It is a ball build that is borderline a support build, and I think is weak as a whole. But that being said, there's not too much that is better to take its place. Spear Ice Gauntlet, I think, is the closest build to being able to take its space. It has the ability to hold space, pressure people, lock them down, and set people up for other people in your group to kill them. Spear Hatchet, I think, could be played in a ball setup, but the problem is it tends to lack a bit on the survivability side, even with Hatchet. I don't think it's bad damage. It's mostly the being able to live in proximity to Void Gauntlets where you can very quickly get blown up. It is noteworthy that if Hatchet procs and you have disease on you, it will take that into effect, as well as if you're on a Sacred and Hatchet procs, you will be able to get a bonus heal off of that. It is noteworthy as well if you haven't been looking at the PTR too much, Hatchet has been changed to give you 50% of your max HP back immediately versus the invincibility for 3 seconds. So that's a bit of a buff to playing Hatchet in a clump setup. It's a bit of a nerf for playing Hatchet outside of point. But that being said, I still think this build is interesting. I just don't think it will see primarily play, but it is still solid. Greatsword Hatchet is in a similar spot where you could run as in a Killsquad. I think now that ball groups are tending to be more trying to live from fire staffs, they have to be a little bit more able to dodge things. This build can be good. Along with Spear, Greatsword's able to get access to that 150 dex, so they're able to spam dodges and kind of maneuver around all the fire staff DPS. Even though they lose their shirking for it, they are still able to prevent DPS by basically making that DPS 0 by dodging things. Still seems solid, even though it is a little bit of a weaker build. Spear SNS is a build that could be used for marking things. This was kind of interesting because I think you could land the AoE Fortify from SNS and then land land the AoE Weaken and slow from the SNS and then kind of go in with the Spear. It seems a little bit more promising than some of these other builds in the solid tier, but I don't think is quite good enough. The other one that's kind of interesting is Void Blade Ice Gauntlet, which seems like with the 300 con change, it could be good. The only problems I have with it are basically I don't think it can engage super well, but it can follow up super well. So comboed with a Great Axe Warhammer or a Spear Ice Gauntlet, I think that build can be good. I'm not sure if you would ever be in a spot where you want to run a Void Blade and a normal Void Gauntlet, or if you would only run the Void Blade or the Void Gauntlet, but it seems like a build that could contend for that ball spot. A BB Great Axe is a build that people have theorized it would due to the nerfs. I don't think it's as good anymore. But the base idea was you could replace Warhammer with a BB, because BB tended to be a better weapon, but due to the nerfs, I'm not sure that that's the case anymore. And Greatsword Warhammer is a build that's been gutted across the board, is no longer viable. On the support side, medium IGVG with Void Blade and the traditional variant seem to be the two best ones to go for. VG has access to old Rend, which tends to be significantly better on my testing than other kinds of Rend. It tends to be about 20% better versus light players and less versus medium and less versus heavy, but it is a very, very big significant difference when you look at the Ren from VG versus other players, and VG is the only class in the game that has access to what I would consider to be a good, viable PvP Ren. Everything else, the Rens are basically worthless and are not worth going for or prioritizing, but the VG Ren in particular tends to be very, very good, and I think has the potential to open up the meta due to how strong it is. Spear Ice Gauntlet, I think, could also be something that's played as a support that's able to go for weekends. I put this in the ball build. I put this as a ball group. I put it in the support group. I think it can play multiple ways depending on what attributes and what perks that you go for. Another thing that's kind of interesting I put in here is a Smolder Kitten build, if you will. I made a video on this. The base idea was that you land Smolder for your other fire staffs that were more nuke oriented to take advantage of. This would probably be played in medium or heavy as either a tank or a support. This will allow your fire staffs that are more range oriented to get that 25% bonus damage, as well as you can spread a lot of debuffs to your opponents that will get you ult super fast because they tend to be dots. I think this has the potential to be good. I'm just not sure if it is good yet or not. BB Hatchet's kind of interesting because the hatchet applies a weakened and a disease. Blunderbuss seems like it has decent damage. I just think with the changes to BB, it's not as viable anymore. BBVG's in a very similar spot where the changes to BB not being survivable, it's not super viable anymore. You can't use the BB to tank like you used to be able to, and I think you have to rely on Ice Gauntlet. Ice Gauntlet BB as a support in medium is long dead at this point. On live, it's not even played. On the PTR, it's not going to be played even more. BB as a whole on the live client was really only played in the Killsquad, and due to the nerfs with Fortify and the DPS across the board, I don't think it makes sense to play BB in the majority of builds anymore. Moving on to tanks, we have the most broken tank spec in the game that has come up in the recent history with SNS as a whole. SNS VG seems very good. SNS IG seems very good. There are some other variants that seem more interesting as well. I tend to think VG and IG are best because they could play the VG as sort of an offensive secondary weapon if you want, and you can get the Rens and the weakens from both abilities and really capitalize on people and provide a lot of debuffs to the enemy, as well as huge buffs with the old Fortify that SNS provides to your allies. That will allow you to kind of carry in wars, and I expect that SNS as a whole will be played with at least 2 to 3 in the wars if per war on each side if these Fortify changes last. I could even see it being higher if people do something more interesting like a what do you call it? Like SNS Great Axe, where you would go for the weekend with Great Axe, you go for the weekend with SNS. You have some pressure still. You don't have the Warhammer anymore, but you can still lock people up with the stuns. The stuns could also, on SNS, tend to get around Freedom a little bit better because they have an extension perk, which will not be affected by Freedom. So the stun will at least last like 1.5 seconds, which is very solid. It will set people up that are more range oriented to finish off those low targets. I think this also could be a decent build for peeling backline as well. Heavy IGVG with Void Blade is something that also seems very interesting as a tank. I definitely could see this taking over in terms of a tank role. Before, I thought Spear would be the next best thing on point. I'm not convinced that Spear is the next best thing because I think IGVG tends to outclass it due to its ability to apply weekend and old rend, which is unique to it, as well as provide consistent debuffs. I talked about this a while, how this came out, this would be S tier, and I believe it is S tier with the grit change. Before the grit change, it did not fall nearly as good as a tank. It was not really playable, but with the ability to have grit on your attacks, I think this build is very good. It is also noteworthy that that build is good at farming ult, but you cannot really do damage to people who are blocking, so I would not try to go for SNSs with this build, but you can still bug them with the Oblivion, where it will strip their passive old Fortify that they have on the SNS itself, which is very good for blowing up the SNS targets. SNX Great Axe I talked about a bit. I think this is a kind of a newer build that people have theorized that is not bad on paper at all. 45% weakened is a lot better than people think, and weakened is sort of the new Fortify where it is the best in class debuff. I definitely could see this taking over the game, and tanks as a whole seem very strong next patch, as well as Killsquad and ball builds seem to be weaker. I could also see some of these tank builds being played in a ball setup, just to the ability that the tank builds have to live in typical ball. People will not be able to live as well next patch. It is noteworthy with all these SNS builds where if you get hit by a heavy attack with a fire staff, it does go through it, and you probably will need the elemental version to overcome that. That being said, I still believe the 30% AoE Fortify that it provides to be very significant and will help your team as a whole stay alive. SNS Spear is also something that people have been trying. It seems kind of interesting. In combination with Cyclone, you can basically have infinite stamina on the SNS even with the changes. Without Cyclone, you have really good disruption, and then you can go fall back to your SNS if you want to. It seems like a very flexible build, kind of a hard build to play, sort of like bow spear, or people are trying to play it, but spear is so much of a primary that seems a little bit difficult for me on paper to think this is super good. That being said, both weapons seem very strong right now, and I could see this having a spot next patch. Great Axe Warhammer, I believe, is a pretty solid build next patch, even with the changes in heavy. The disruption that Warhammer provides in terms of stuns and crowd control, I still think is viable on point, while not being viable typically elsewhere. Great Axe will allow people to be grouped up, and Warhammer will allow people to be stunned enough for people outside of point to take advantage of it. I don't think this build is nearly as strong as it was last patch, though, but is still viable enough to be played due to how strong Great Axe as a whole is at grouping people up and at spreading weekend. I think SNS Great Axe has the potential to just completely outclass this build, though, but Warhammer still may be viable, and if it is going to be viable, it will be viable on point. Spear Ice Gauntlet, I believe, is falling off a little bit off the other builds. It's still a good build. It's just I don't think it does enough compared to Void Blade with the change to that having grit for it to be completely viable. There was also a bug before when I was thinking about Spear where if you went for auto attacks, it was actually causing the Perforate passive uh, weekend to apply with the basic attacks for some reason. They have since fixed that bug that will make it so that Spear is a lot less good on the point because Perforate does not have grit and your auto attacks did. So with that being in mind, I think Spear falls down a little bit, but it's still a very solid build. BBIG had the potential to be very good last patch, BBVG as well. With the current patch, I don't see BB being nearly as good to the decrease in Fortify. Fortify and Heavy in particular is about worth a third to a sixth of what it was on the live client. It is not very good, but BB as a whole still has the ability to spread AoE disease, which is unique, and has the potential to still be viable even though it is not super strong as a whole next patch on paper. Fire Step IG with Flamethrower is also something that could be interesting to run on point. This is pretty much the Smolder Kitten setup I talked about before. I don't think it's as good as a tank setup on point, just simply because Fire Staff should not be putting their damage on point, in my opinion, and be focusing the people outside of point, trying to go for one-shots rather than pad damage on the point itself. That being said, it could still be interesting because that Smolder will allow people outside of point to really nuke people on point, and maybe in combination you could blow people up if you're time your abilities correctly. Greatsword Hatchet also seems like it could be something that is run as a tank setup, even though it seems very counterintuitive due to Greatsword's ability to block ranged attacks, its ability to stagger people on the point, much like Warhammer used to do, but a little bit better now than those weapons, as well as have the new hatchet where you get to the half your HP back when you are going to die. It seems like it has the ability to be pretty good, but I don't really see it being super good right away. Moving on to healers. Healers have not changed a ton. Rapier is still probably the best thing to run as a whole. I don't think there's much changing that. Rapier is just too good at positioning your healers to get value. I think there is some problems with Rapier where you can get caught next patch and you can just get insta-deleted because Repost basically does nothing versus Fire Staff. Since the Fire Staff has access to AoEs and the Repost will set you up to be hit very, very quickly. That being said, I still think it's probably a little bit better than other options that you have. Ice Gauntlet is kind of interesting because you have the ability to iframe with that tomb and live a little bit longer, as well as have your ult generate faster, which you could use to help yourself either survive more or pump out something like a AoE life steal bile that has not been used much as of current, but could be better on the next patch. Void Gauntlet seems like it could be interesting with the changes. I don't think you really end up using the Void Blade that much. That being said, it does provide a good heals, and I think we're going to be in a spot next meta where you really want all the heals that you can get, and people are going to consider going back to AoE healers, and Void Gauntlet is part of that. Hatchet is something that I've always thought would be good. It's not really been played a ton. The ability to get back up to 50% HP on Hatchet, I think, is nice as a healer. The only problem with Hatchet as a healer is the fact that you have to stay on Hatchet for a decent amount of time, but with that comes increased survivability. I think there's still an argument to be made that Hatchet could be viable due to its ability to keep healers alive a little bit better than Rapier as a whole, but if you're looking for quick positioning into heals, I think Rapier is better, but if you are kind of 1vx, I think Hatchet tends to be a little bit better at getting away. and helps you live a little bit longer than Rapier would on average. Greatsword and BB, I believe, are outclassed by other builds on this list, but have been used in OPR and in 3v3s to some success, and still could, in those regards, be successful. I just don't see them being as successful as other builds on this list. Moving on to ults. I think Ults Attack Detonate is very, very interesting because it applies new Ren to you, which basically does nothing, which means that Detonate is going to be very, very strong next patch since you have no consequence for going for that big damage that you would have before. It seems like it will be run on most builds across the board. Firestorm's the other really interesting thing because it will allow you to animation cancel key abilities and allow for burst combos that didn't exist before. There are some combos with Firestop that you could not do before that you can do with Firestorm that will result in bigger damage than that you would get with Detonate, which is surprising. I think both of those weapons or both of those ultimates are the best ones that you can run in general. Firestorm, you have some flexibility in terms of what you want to run. On Detonate, you just want the one that hits the hardest, which should be the Cunning variant. In terms of other ults that are good, Cannon seems like it will be pretty good next patch, but I think it's generally still outclassed by Detonate. It still seems like it can do a lot, it's just not as good animation canceling out of things like Detonate can. The other thing a Detonate allows you to do is not lose your weapon debuffs when you pop it, so that seems kind of interesting as a whole with that. Bile seems a lot more interesting than it used to be because you might be able to burst people with it. I think it's not bad to run this if you run an ice pylon in general, just to kind of chuck it around, especially because disease will be less prevalent since BB is not as prevalent. It does apply exhaust with the exhausted bile build, which I think is generally the best one. The lifesteal one could be interesting for healers. I don't think bile is bad, it's just kind of conditional. You need to have people collapse on top of others where you chuck the bile for bile to show its true value. The nice part about bile is you can kind of chuck it and not really have to worry about it, and I think due to the changes to Ren, bile gets a little bit better than Vines used to be. Vines, as I've alluded to, is not as good next patch due to the fact that the Ren doesn't really do anything. In terms of other aspects, Vines is still good for the weekend, is still good for the lockdown. I just don't see people going to Brutal variant as much anymore. It can still be run with IGVG, just have to know that you're using the Vines just to hold people in place for 3 seconds now, not for the actual damage increase that comes with it. Stoneform, I don't think is as good next patch. The whole bruiser shenanigans with it is not as good. I think Stoneform is mostly going to be used for healers with the healing Stoneform. I think other classes are better to use other ults, but the change for Stoneform being moving from Old Fortified to New Fortified simply does not do nearly as much as it used to, and the only util from it is basically the ability to gain grit and the ability to heal if you use the healing variant. I don't see any other spots where Stoneform really can be used unless you want to do a build where you're trying to get off of the 300 con and still have good DPS, in which case the detonating Stoneform is probably the one that you're looking for. I don't really see a spot where this is really common in the meta, though. Ascent will never be good until they buff it. I'm surprised they haven't buffed it yet, because it's a really cool looking ability, but it just does not do anything. In terms of defense, I think this is basically the same. Detonate is still the best because the Ren doesn't do anything to you anymore. You do really good damage with it. Firestorm is good because it can animation cancel. You can also do things with it that are really cool, like removing the debuffs on your team. You give everyone on your team Empower, which is super good. You apply Weaken to the other team, which is super good because Weaken tends to be the best in slot debuff for next patch, in my opinion, due to the Fortify changes. And a way to mitigate the damage coming at you would be applying Weaken, which is why Spears seems so strong, and other abilities that apply weaken like SNS and Great Axe. That being said, I still think that other ults are generally better like Detonate. Cannon on defense is really good still for 3-2-1ing healers from range. Don't think it's ever going to be bad. Bile is still really solid. I think this is basically the same as Attack, where it can be good if people collapse on you. I think it's generally a little bit better than Vines. You won't be able to get ult charge off the dummies anymore, so you're going to get these ults a lot less fast on defense. So Bile is not going to be as much of a check it every now and then kind of thing. It's going to be a holding it for a big push and then dropping it when that happens. I still think it's going to be really good for forcing out cleanse pots, and it's going to do a lot more than people think it does on paper. Vines, good at holding people in place, that's all it's going to really do. Stoneform, not bad for healers. I don't think it's as good for anyone else, and Ascent is Ascent. So that's what I have for this list, guys. The big changes that are coming to this versus the live client, our fire staff is going to be very, very big. Void Gauntlet got a huge buff with everything else being the new variant of Ren, and Void Gauntlet has the old variant of Ren for some reason. And SNS seems very, very strong because it applies an old Fortify instead of new Fortify. In general, the theme with this patch is you've tried to find something that is the old version of Render Fortify, and you play that because that tends to be better than anything that is newer. To me, this is kind of a mistake in terms of the design as a whole, and there should be something that is more uniform between the really overpowered old Fortify and the not useful at all new Fortify. That being said, we're still going to play around with what we have, and for what we have right now, I think this list is pretty comprehensive. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.